And we're going to welcome everybody on YouTube for our Wednesday morning study session, the Wednesday morning study session that shall not be named is the name that's not named of and we're so thrilled to have so many people here this morning. Got a lot of people who are online. So welcome to
This meeting is
Ron
being
and
recorded.
Arlene. Welcome to Noel, Susanna, Alan, Sid, maybe Harriet, Arnold, Jeff, Larry, and maybe Jane. All here, ready to study. And we're going to, at the end of the class today, choose the next topics. We hadn't chosen a topic for today. So since we all want to be political at times, I thought one of the best discussions would be who wrote the Torah. It's a wonderful study on the Torah itself. This again is from a historical perspective. There's 5 books as we know. So who wrote them? We don't have drafts. All we have is the Bible and the Torah itself. The oldest known pieces we have, of course, are the Dead Sea Scrolls, circa 0, a little before, a little after. But we don't know who wrote it. Some would say it came straight from God. Some would say Moses wrote it. Obviously, those are 2 legitimate answers in Judaism. But if you're looking for more of a historical perspective, if you believe that it was written by human hands, then whose hands were they? And you have to understand this type of discussion was considered heresy for most of our history. Although there were discussions here then by rabbis, but people like Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, could be exiled from his community for discussing this or saying that God didn't write it or Moses didn't write it. In the 18th century, you could start talking about it, but really it's the 19th century and when we started this archaeological, historical view of the Bible and who wrote it. And it's not only in the Jewish world, but in the Christian world, obviously, as well. And they kind of join together to kind of decide how we're going to approach this. And it's really interesting because it's a very difficult discussion because you're dealing not with just, the Iliad and who Homer is, but you're dealing with religion, which would be quite controversial. The interesting part, though, in Judaism is not always and usually hasn't taken the Bible, or especially the Torah, always literally. So Jews are not traditionally literalists, although today there are plenty of them, but historically not. So it's not as troublesome in some cases. So what we're going to look at is first, what first brought people's attention to the fact that maybe this book was written by human hands and not by God. And then we'll look at one of the general theories as to who wrote the 5 books and who also edited them and who redacted them and who put them together. So let's go to some very quick introductions to what led people to believe maybe there was multiple writers or people writing. I think we've all heard that. Have people discussed this before, heard about this before? The Deuteronomic hypothesis theory. So the very first indication that there may be multiple writers or that was edited comes from chapter 1 of the Bible. Chapter 1 of Genesis, chapter 1 of everything. So from the very beginning, there is a question of, wait a minute, something is a little off here. Now, what is off? Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, day 7. This is the creation story from Genesis 1, chapter 1. Every day there is something created. It's very obvious. It's an organized religion. God is organized. Very easy to see how gravity is created here and this forth. So it's really well done and beautiful. Leading up to the Sabbath when God rests, whatever that means. And then everything goes haywire in chapter 2. Why does it go haywire in chapter 2? It's not the study itself. It's not the story of Adam and Eve, which is an incredibly beautiful story and one of the great stories in human history. It is something in the story that is strange, and that is the order. We have in chapter 1 a very specific order, and then we come to chapter 2, and guess what? The order is different. So it's not difficult to say, wait a minute. You have chapter 1 that comes in a particular order, and then the very next chapter is in a different order. What's going on here? Because, of course, you have everything created, and then you have human being, and then you have animals and human beings. But in this, we see in many cases human beings are created before maybe trees. That human beings are created before animals, because it says God created the animals to be the friends. And human beings are created before birds and maybe even fish. Remember, animals are at least on day 6, right, or day 5, but fish and that are on the day before. No, animals are day 6, fish and birds are day 5. So let me try that. Yeah, 5 are fish and birds, 6 animals and humans. But in the second story, it's humans and then animals and birds. And so it's very obvious, and maybe even humans were created before trees. And so from this little change, we can say, wait a minute, there is something very strange going on here. Now, how many of you have ever heard of this theory, by the way? Okay, so not everybody has. So we'll go through and look at some of the stories. So what are some other stories that led people to think maybe there wasn't one writer? And the flood story is another one. Everybody knows about the flood, right? Noah was in the ark. How did the animals go into the ark? Who remembers that? They went in the ark. What do we teach our kids? They went in the ark
2 by 2.
by 2. And that's what we read. The animals went in 2 by 2 in chapter 6. But then in chapter 7, guess what they didn't? They go on 2 by 2, but then in chapter 7, as you look where I'm reading, of every clean beast you shall take 7 pairs, the male and his female, and of beasts that are not clean, 1 pair. Of birds of the air, 7 pairs, to keep seed alive in the face of the earth. So wait a minute, we just said it's going to go on 2 by 2, and then a chapter later they're going 2 by 2, except for the animals that you need to sacrifice. You need 7 pairs of those, which was not mentioned at all in the previous chapter. It came out of left field. In fact, we've never seen sacrifice until even mentioned. It's never even mentioned until Genesis chapter 7 after. So all of a sudden, and then what about the birds? What kind of birds are there? First it's a raven, but wait a minute, then it's a dove, and then it's a raven. And so there's little things that are different. And so does everybody see what I have on here? Chapter 7. Here's chapter 7. You'll see italicized sections, and you'll see sections that are not italicized. For instance, verse 5, and Noah did according to all the Lord commanded. That's italicized. The next line, and Noah was 600 years with a flood of water. That's not italicized. Why are some italicized? Because if you take the italicized out and leave the unitalicized in, you have 2 complete separate stories that work fine by themselves. And it almost seems like somebody took 2 stories and did what? And went like this. Put them together and shoved them together in a pretty decent way. But the amazing thing is, How many stories do you know that you can take apart and have two full stories that have complete meaning? And this is not the only place that happens. It happens in other places as well. You've got the story, one about the raven, then the other, you got the dove. You got different times. One story you have 2 by 2, the other story you've got sacrificial animals. Two completely different stories. So this is another clue here. In Genesis, another clue comes here with the story of Ephraim and Manasseh. You may not know the story of Ephraim and Manasseh, but it's a story about Joseph's children. Manasseh is the eldest, Ephraim is the youngest. So when Jacob goes to bless his grandchildren, the right hand is your strongest hand, the left hand is your weakest hand. So when you bless your two children, you put your right hand on the eldest and your left hand on the youngest, because the eldest gets the firstborn blessing, gets the double share, is going to be the leader of the family. But when Jacob goes to bless his children, what does he do? He does this and puts his right hand on Ephraim and his left hand on Manasseh. He gives Ephraim the elder son blessing. Now, why is this important? It doesn't seem like a big deal. It's important because it's very obvious in history that Ephraim is a major tribe, the second most powerful tribe, the tribe that becomes the leaders of the kingdom of Israel, and Manasseh is a small little tribe that disappears very quickly. So is it coincidental that a powerful tribe ends up having a powerful original tribal leader? Where else do we see something like this? We see it in the story of Judah. Judah is one of the seediest of the 12 brothers, probably the rebel leader of the 12 brothers. Throw his son in the pit. Let's sell our brother into slavery. I'm going to condemn my daughter-in-law to endless heartache. I'm going to sleep with a woman who I believe is a woman of the night, but ends up being my daughter-in-law. There's all these shenanigans with Judah. However, at the end of the story of Joseph, who ends up becoming the head of the family? It's not Joseph. It's not Reuben. It is Judah. Judah has this incredible redemption where at the end of the Joseph story, he is the hero. He is the leader of the Jewish people. Remember, Joseph is really more Egyptian. Judah becomes the head of the Jewish world. Guess which of the 12 tribes was the most powerful of all? Judah. Just like Ephraim was probably the second most powerful, or the tied, Judah will become the head because Judah is the family of King David himself. What other areas? One of the most obvious comes from the story of Aaron. Aaron leads the people in creating the golden calf. Aaron leads a revolt against Moses alongside Miriam. Miriam is punished by being given terrible skin disease for a week. Aaron is the leader of the revolt against Moses. He's the leader of the golden calf. What is the punishment given to Aaron for each of these things and for other things? What punishments does Aaron receive? The answer is he is never punished for anything. There's not even a negative word said about him. How does he keep getting off all the time? Like my little brother always got off, and I'm the one who always got in trouble. Why is Aaron getting off? That's a big question. Why wasn't he punished for the golden calf? Why? And even more so, we talked about the Noah story. There's a rebellion against Moses. This is the biggest rebellion by Korach. And again, we see that if you take the italicized and take it out, you have an even clearer 2 complete stories about 2 separate rebellions. Korach rebelling against Moses, and Dathan and Abiram rebelling against Aaron. They want to be the high priest. Korach wants to be the leader of the nation. Remember, Moses is the leader. Aaron is the priest, the religious leader. Korach, but when we get to chapter 16, they're actually one story of one rebellion. It's an incredible way. Now, something less obvious. How many of you remember the story of the rock? The people are thirsty. Moses hits the rock and water comes from the rock. And the people are given water. Well, that's Exodus. In Numbers, we have the same story, except for when Moses hits the rock, he gets in trouble for it. Like in Exodus, he's supposed to do it. In Numbers, he gets punished for it and can't go into the land of Israel, maybe. So why is he rewarded for doing it in Exodus and then punished for doing it in Numbers? Seemingly the exact same thing. So these are the questions. We also have things like the story of Balaam, where if you take out pieces, you have a different story about a talking donkey that is kind of mixed in. How many of you remember Joseph being sold into slavery? How many? Raise your hand if you remember that. Who is he sold to? Because in one sentence, he's sold to the Midianites, and the next sentence, he's sold to the Ishmaelites, which are not the same people at all. How could he be sold to both? In Deuteronomy, we have a really strange passage here. What is the passage? In Deuteronomy, it says, when you have a king, which is very strange because never are we told do we ever have a king. We're not going to have a king for hundreds of years. And not only that, it specifically says earlier in the Torah, you shouldn't have a king. But all of a sudden, in Deuteronomy, out of nowhere, it starts talking about the king that you might have, like out of nowhere. And then it says, if you ever have a king, the king has to spend his days writing the Torah or writing law. Who has the right to tell a king that he has to spend his days writing rules? He can't have limited money, limited horses. Why are we putting these strange restrictions on a king that we don't have and don't plan to have and won't have for 250 years? Well, 250 years or so. So these are the questions that were asked time and again, all of these strange things. Not only that, what about God? Why does God have so many names? And why are certain sections is God called Yahweh and other sections Elohim, especially these two big? Why sometimes do we seem to have a supernatural God of the cosmos and sometimes more personal of a God? So there are a lot of questions to be asked. And this is what led people to think about this Deuteronomic hypothesis that there were multiple writers. And so this was the process that people went into, is how do we go through history and find who are the writers, who are the editors, who are the redactors, and where did we get the finalized version of the Torah? Now, all of this is theory because there's absolutely no physical evidence. We don't have a copy of a section of the Torah from the year 950 BCE. We only have copies once they're in their finished form or close to their finished form. Again, the Dead Sea Scrolls are pretty similar. There are slight differences here and there. So let's go through history. And if you have any questions, please raise your hand. I can't see everybody. And talk about where they come from. The Deuteronomic hypothesis believes there are at least 4 different writers. 4. Very easy to remember. J, E, P, and D. Those are what they're known as, JEPD. Now, there are other theories that expand that there are more rioters and different things, but that's kind of the basic idea. So you just got to remember 4 letters, JEPD, which spell absolutely nothing. You think they would have picked some sort of acronym that we could remember, but once you put the D after the P, it ruins any chance, because Jebed does not, you need, so if you put an O maybe, Jepo, that would kind of work, or an A, Jepa. But so JEP, Jep, and then D. So those are the 4 thoughts. Now, where do JEP come from and how do they decide? They look at language. They look at the name of God. They look at the politics and the history of the time period. And that's how, and they look at different religious annotations, different ways looking at the world. And so that's how they divide it up into JEPD. So J is for Yahweh, because that is, when you see the name, it's not really Yahweh, it's really, you know, the name of God, Yud-He Vav-He. They put that as one group, the Yud-He Vav-He group. Another group is E, which is the Elohim group. Whenever you see God's name is Elohim. P is for priests. D is for the book of Deuteronomy, because they believe that is a separate book entirely. There's also redactors, or editors, somebody who combine J and E. So basically how it's written is J, then E, then J and E are combined, then P is added into the J and E, and then D is the 5th book by itself. So again, J, then E, J and E combined, P added in, and then D is a whole nother book. So let's go look at how they figure this out. And it's very complicated, and that's why I have my notes to remind myself all the time exactly. There's a lot of intricacies that have to do with a lot of things. Who are the priests? Who are the priests in power? Who are not the priests in power? Who are the tribe of Judah? Who are the tribe of Ephraim, the 2 major tribes? What is the kingship? Who has the power to restrict the king? Who is more interested in sacrifices? And so let's look at it. So J is the first one. That's the oldest version, a little bit older than E. So who is J? J is basically someone who supports what tribe? The tribe of Judah. And the name Adonai. That's the J, can also be for Judah. So these are probably the tribe of Judah. And that means they are in the country of Judah. All right, J is, now, again, it comes to J again, we talk about Judah, who is the redemptive hero of the story in Genesis. We talk about someone who is very supportive of Aaron and David. David, of course, is the first king, the second king, but the king from the tribe of David, from the Judah. So Judah is important. We also believe that it was probably priests who wrote it. Which priests? Now we think of one set of priests. That's like saying there's one set of Jews. There's lots of priests. It just, we could all be priests, but that doesn't mean we're working at the temple in Jerusalem. Because who works at the temple in Jerusalem? The priests that are in power. So that is who we're looking at. And the priests in power in J are the priests who consider themselves descended from Aaron himself, a particular priestly clan. And so who are they supporting? They're supporting things that happen to that support the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant, where does it go? It goes to Jerusalem. And it becomes part of the temple. So when you talk about the ark and the beauty of the ark, and we spend pages and pages and pages talking about the ark, we're talking about the Aaron priests in Jerusalem. And so the J is like 9th century. E is actually a little older. Sorry about that. The J. So we're talking about the Aaron priests that are not very supportive of the tribe of Ephraim or the country of Israel, because that country. So J is the Aaron priests living in the 9th century during the time of the kingdom of David's descendants. So J, Judah, Adonai used that name. King David supporters, Aaron supporters, Ark supporters, sacrifice supporters. What do I mean by sacrifice supporters? Where do we see sacrifices? At the time of Noah, all of a sudden they start sacrificing. That came out of left field. When did Noah get permission to sacrifice animals? Why does Noah have 7 sets of animals to sacrifice? The answer is because the book is written by a group of people who are in control of the sacrifice. We're sacrificing at the temple in the year 850 BCE. We want to show that sacrifice is really important. So what are we going to do? We're going to make sure that who was sacrificing to God? Noah himself. Sacrifices go all the way back to Noah. Did Abraham sacrifice animals to God? Of course he did. There are stories about Abraham. Did Aaron sacrifice? Of course he did. There is stories about sacrifice. We're very excited about Aaron. We're very excited about Abraham. We're very excited about David. Who were you not excited about? Moses. Moses is not one of our characters for J. We are the Aaron folk. We are the Abraham folk. So what happens to Moses? Is Moses perfect? Does Moses make a lot of mistakes? Does Moses get punished and not allowed to go into the land of Israel? Who would write something about Moses being imperfect and not going into the land of Israel? People who do not want to emphasize Moses. Who are those people? The priests from Aaron in the temple in the 9th century. And so any of this, they believe, traces to this particular group. Now, that's J. Now, E, which is a little older, but probably a lot of it was written after, is Elohim. Who is E connected with? E can also be for Ephraim. Who is Ephraim? Ephraim is the tribe that controls the north. In the 10th century, there is going to be a civil war in the Jewish world. The 10 tribes are going to separate and form their own country in the north. They're going to call it Israel. Who is the main tribe who breaks apart? It is Ephraim. Who in the Bible, in the Genesis, is given the strong blessing from Jacob himself? Ephraim over Manasseh. You can't get rid of Manasseh. You can't say Ephraim is the older son because everybody knows he isn't. Everybody knows Ephraim is the second son, is the younger son. It's a known story probably at the time. And so you can't say Ephraim's the older son because nobody's going to believe you. Everybody's going to say, no, that's not true. We all know he's the younger. What are they going to say? Well, Ephraim is the younger son. However, he gets the main blessing. It's even better. He's the younger son, but he's so good, he's going to get the #1 blessing and he's going to be in charge. That's what you do. And that's what happened. Now, this is all theory. Okay, this is not proof. All right. So, who else is E? It's people who are not Aaron priests. They have their own priests in the north, but they're not the Aaron priests. Those priests are in the south. So what do? You have negative stories about who? Aaron. Now, you can't say Aaron is punished because he wasn't. People know that Aaron isn't punished. But you can start stories about he is the one who did the golden calf. He is the one who revolted against Moses. He's not punished because they know he isn't. They can tell negative stories about Judah. Judah is the man who killed. Judah sold his brother into slavery. Even though he's redeemed, they can stress the negative stories about Judah. So you can see it's really kind of political intrigue, writing stories about how great you are and negative stories about your opponent. Now, we would never do this today. That is a joke. And then you put it in the background in history and say, look, Moses was the most important person. That's who the Shiloh priests believe they descend from. So they're going to emphasize Moses. The golden calf is a negative symbol. So you have to look at who thought a golden calf was a positive symbol. That's King Jeroboam. But who didn't like King Jeroboam? The priest he kicked out. The northern priests who were not in power are maybe writing this against their new King Jeroboam. So again, it's all about political intrigue. You got J and you got E. You got two different stories. Now the question is, are they original stories? Or was there a story already written that they both knew about that they changed it? Nobody knows. Nobody knows if there was this original first books of the Bible, first 4 books that were out there, and then J and E took those stories, or did they do it independently? We don't know. All we do know is at some point J and E are combined. So at some point, these two different books of there's 2 stories. There's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers 1, Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers 2. And there, yes, Larry.
Rabbi, when you examine, let's say, U.S. history, which is a lot easier to understand, because it's so well documented compared to, something 2,500 or 3,000 years ago, and how the Constitution came together and how the United States, after the Articles of Confederation, came together, where compromises were made from these 13 disparate individual colonies that were brought together, and they each gave up something or some sense. The main reason seemed to be that they had recognized the threat of this autocratic government in England that was ruling them at the time, and they wanted to assure, that it was we the people, the democracy, that was going to take place now. So what was the motivation? I assume the hypothesis is correct, that there are at least 4 writers, probably many of those 4, they're probably subsets of writers. It wasn't just one guy, who wrote the J and one guy who wrote the E. There were probably dozens of J's and dozens of E's, and then they put it all together. And the same thing even with the priests. There were probably many priests that had their hand in it. But let's say there were only the 4 writers. What was the motivation? Was there this overriding threat? Like, they saw this, threat to them, and they said the 10 tribes in the north and the 2 tribes in the south, we got to get together now. We got to, instead of having a god with 2 names or maybe even 2 gods, what was the motivation for pulling that all together at that time?
Well, that's an interesting story. So remember that you've got 2 Jewish countries for about 200 years. Sometimes they get along, sometimes they don't. It's like distant cousins. Sometimes you work together and you trade, and sometimes you're fighting with each other. They got their 2 stories. They're competing as to who is the real, authentic leaders of the Jewish world. But then what happens in 722, the north is destroyed by the Assyrians. This is where we get the 10 lost tribes. So 10 tribes disappear. Because there's 2 tribes in the south, 10 tribes in the north, and then of course the priests are split. There's actually 13 tribes because Joseph gets 2. So 10 in the north, 2 in the south, and the priests are, and the Levites are spread out all around. Syrians come into the north, destroy the north. We do not know what happens to those 10 tribes. Some of them are sent off to the Syrian Empire and disappear. Some of them filter down to the south into Judah. And when this happens, this is when tribal Judaism ends. Because you got these filterings of Jews, these 10 tribes just coming to the south, and all of a sudden they're just Jews. They mix together, probably have issues at first, but a generation or two, they're just Hebrews. There's no longer, you may have some tribal affiliation, but you're no longer a tribal community, you're just one community. And so there's a belief that after the destruction of the north in 722, over the next 100 years, at some point, J&E was put together. And they did it in a way as not to upset anybody or to upset everybody. Because what they did is they didn't change it completely. You know, I can take two stories and meld them together beautifully. They took the direct stories and just mashed them together and then kind of figured out a way to edit them. So you have the full belief systems of both sides in this book. You've got the Aaronite priests from J. You've got the Moses priests from E. And they're completely intertwined, but you can, at points, you can literally take out sections. You can take out the section of sacrifice from the Noah story. You can take, and the story of Menashe, and the story of, the story of the revolt against Moses by Korach. You can take out two different stories. The creation story, two different stories. So you can see where certain things have been added in here and there. So that was the decision when they put these two together, probably a conscious one, probably because these are well-known stories. They're probably told more than they're written. And now we want to make sure everybody gets their piece of the pie and everybody has their place in the story. And that's probably what happened. This is the guesswork. Again, sometime after 722. And then we get, they believe, the next book written. There's a debate as to which one's written, the D or the P next. But a lot of people believe it's the D. The D is one book, Deuteronomy. During the kingship of Josiah in the late 7th century, so 610, 615 BCE, a book is found. The book is found by some priests. It's taken to a female named Huldah, who is a prophetess. Huldah says this is a legitimate book of God. Then it's brought to the king. And they believe this is the book of Deuteronomy, which is a retelling of the first 4 books from a very different perspective. So who wrote the book of D? That is a question. Number 1. They put restrictions on the king. So obviously it's not written by the king, because the king is probably not going to put restrictions on himself. Certainly some kings would, but most likely it's not. There's only one place to worship, but it's not centralized worship necessarily tied to the Jerusalem priesthood. It's priests that are not connected to the centralized priesthood in Jerusalem. So what does it mean? It's priests that are not in power. It's not the priests that are in power at this time. It's another group of priests. They think it may be priests who are living in Shiloh because they're supportive of the king with restrictions, but they're not so centralized with the ark. And so they believe it's another group of priests that are not connected to Solomon and David that are not connected to Aaron. So it's another group of priests. It's mostly always written by priests, obviously. And so it's also seemingly written before the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem. It's kind of a pre-destruction of the temple. So this is an entirely different book. If you read it, this book D reads nothing. Deuteronomy reads nothing like the first 4 books. The first 4 books work together. Deuteronomy is written the same way as all the other books, going all the way to the 2nd book of Kings. And so they believe the people who wrote Deuteronomy also wrote Joshua, also wrote Judges, the 2 books of Samuel, and the 2 books of Kings. And that's one series. But this book D was written before the destruction of the temple. They were written basically before the destruction of the temple. So that is D. P is the last one. That's the 4th one. And P is very different. We don't know. There's a lot of debate as to P. Some believe it is started by priests or people who were alive before the destruction, but really written also after the destruction of the temple. P is written to compete with JE. So the first 4 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, there were two forms of it that were combined, and now here's a 3rd one. And P is then added in to that later. So you get a 3rd book added in. And this book is even more supportive of Aaron. The only time you can sacrifice is through Aaron and the priests. This is the one that adds the 7 extra animals maybe to the ark. I said earlier, but this is the one. This is the one that says the priests are the intermediaries between the people and God. This is the one centered really on the priests. That's why it's called P. And this is the one who really stresses the temple even more so. So this is the 4. You've got E and J written, then combined. Then you've got Deuteronomy added in. And then you've got P, which is meshed in there. And so now you have this whole section. And some believe that it was all edited, redacted, and finalized by the great leader Ezra himself, who was a 5th century leader in the country of Judah or Israel, that time period, and that he is the one who brought it all together. So in other words, the first pieces are written down in the 900s, and the final book is finished in the 500s. So we're talking a book that took 400 years to edit. Most editors today would not take that long. That is a joke. 400 years is a long time. There are other issues with the other books, but that's how it's done. J and E. E maybe started first. J and E. J and E are meshed. They combine with D, and then P has come in. And then later on, Ezra puts it all together in a way that makes it easy for us to understand. So, this is what we see. A hodgepodge of stories from different perspectives that when are brought together, people are very conscious that I want all sides of the story known. It could be very easy if I, as a, Israeli, I'm not going to use American politics, I'm a Likudnik. For me as a Likudnik to take the stories and make it all from the Likud perspective or all from the labor perspective. But whoever redacted and put these stories together did the exact opposite. They left all of the perspectives in from the different priests of different ages. So you have negative stories about Aaron and negative stories about Moses. You have stories about the centralness of the ark and stories that are not. You have stories that talk about the importance of Abraham, stories that talk about the importance of Moses. You have stories that emphasize Ephraim, stories that emphasize Judah, stories that are negative about Judah, stories that emphasize sacrifice, stories that are not supportive of sacrifice, stories that are more centered on the universe, stories that are more centered on individuals. And so, yes, Jane. And you're on mute, by the way.
After you read the Torah, you hold it up and you say, from the mouth of God to the hand of man. What part of the Torah are they talking about?
Well, what's important to realize is if you believe in the Deuteronomic hypothesis, which many of us do, including me, you're talking about a book that the stories probably go down for hundreds of years, if not thousands, that takes at least 400 years to edit. Is that a miracle? This is not a literate society. These scrolls are being passed down and stories are being passed down from generation to generation in a world that, although the Jewish world is actually pretty literate already, we believe by the 6th century, it's still an unbelievable, it's not unbelievable, it is impossible that a book can be edited over 400 years, continually passed down, maybe longer. Many people think it's not finished until the year 90 CE, 1,000 years later. So you could have a book that possibly had been edited for 2,000 years. That is impossible. It cannot happen. But yet it did. So whether you believe it came from God to Moses directly, or you believe it's edited over hundreds and hundreds of years, it's an impossible reality. And then you look back at the other books from the ages. I mean, it's not the only book, and there's certainly stories that predate it, but there's nothing like it in ancient society. Nothing even close. It is an animal that is almost from a different planet. It is not a story. It is a way of living. It is not centered on creating these massive heroic characters, which most of the writings of the ages are. It's talking about human beings that are fallible, very fallible. It's not talking about power gods that are fighting with each other. It's talking about a belief in one God that wants human beings to behave as good human beings. It is so far beyond anything from the time period that it should not exist. That's how I look at it. I mean, it should not exist. There is no way this book should exist today. Larry.
And you know, there's that old saying that the victors are the ones that write history. Yet in this case, the thing that always troubled me about this joining of these two hypotheses is that the so-called victor, let's say the southern part of what would be Israel at the time, or the victors basically, that by default almost, because the other 10 tribes kind of disappear. We don't know where they went. Maybe some of them did come south into, you know, Jerusalem and places. But nonetheless, they actually include their story in there, which is very benevolent in a way, you know. Yet you would say, okay, look, it's a symbol that, you know, they lost. They didn't have the right religion. God wasn't with them. You know, they were conquered. And now we have the right religion. So let's just kind of forget about their part of it. Yet they took their part of it and they wrote it into this compromise document, you know, this blended document. And it just seems like it's against human nature. It's against what we've always learned in history, you know, that the victors write history.
And that is an excellent point, because whoever put J and E together, we don't know if it was somebody, we know We believe it was written at a certain period, but we don't know if the person is descended from E or descended from the J tradition or descended from another tradition. We just know they put them both. I mean, it just, whoever put them together, we believe, was looking at all sides of the equation, especially with the redaction, which is unheard of because you're right. You look at ancient Egypt. The new king takes over, the new pharaoh, he gets rid of a lot of the previous pharaoh stuff unless that pharaoh was his father. It's the victors, and this is giving the perspectives from all sides. Not only that, they also will look at their own characters and show their flaws. So everybody is very much willing to show the flaws of their own character as well, which is very strange and unheard of. Is again, you read the Iliad, which is a fabulous book, but it is very centered on every individual is a superhero, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how incredible they are. The main character is not the main, but Achilles is supposed to be this incredible being. He spends the whole book sulking, but they never talk about it in that perspective. He's still this hero, but he basically spends the whole book sulking until the last battle, and then he's killed. But yet, if it was written from a biblical perspective, they would talk about how Achilles is a whiny baby, and he should get over this. Yes, he got passed over, whatever, go out and fight. You could win this war and it could be over. But it does not do that.
The Torah was supposedly issued, to Moses intact, verbally, Mount Sinai, right? Where all the tribes were present. Where all the tribes were present. So the differences between the two names, were there things that were interpreted differently then, would you think, between the northern tribes and the southern tribes at the time? In other words, aside from the fact that one called them Yahweh and one called them Elohim, were there differences in the way Judaism was practiced? Were there basically two different gods in addition to the two different names?
Yo, definitely. Now, again, you got to remember, Judaism is not even in the individual places. They were not, there's always this schism, this force between one God and multiple gods, behaving, not behaving. There is this, tension that is completely there for hundreds of years, both in the north and the south. More so even in the north, where they don't have the centralized worship in one kingdom. But it's always there. So there's a wide range of perspectives. But the general perspective is always God is right. You should have one God. You should pray and be a good human being. Just people aren't always doing it. But that is an overarching belief system, but not everybody follows it. When it comes to rituals and who's in charge, that's where the debates are. Is it Moses? Is it Aaron? Is it the Zadok priests, or is it the priests of Shiloh? Is it the Ephraim, or is it Judah? Is it the people who support the king or don't support the king? So that is where a lot of this comes from. But the belief system is generally pretty similar in many ways in terms of, how to behave. But a lot of the other things are different. You're right. It's a really complex series of discussions over hundreds of years. That's why I think it's so amazing. That's why we read it every week. If it had been edited in a way that made it like a very linear story from one point of view, I don't think we as Jewish people don't like one point of view. It's like the only thing we agree on is there shouldn't be one point of view. And so that's probably why it's lasted this long. Jeff.
Rabbi, how do the other books fit into this whole thing?
The other books in some ways are similar, especially the ones that come after Deuteronomy. Now, they're not from the same perspective because they weren't put in, but certainly you see a lot of things that tells us maybe things were added. For instance, Isaiah lives for hundreds of years. So this leads to the theory that there are multiple Isaiahs. maybe 3, maybe even more than that. So there are other stories that are connected as well. Some stories seem to be written by individuals, like Jeremiah. Some stories are connected, and have similar theories, like Samuel, which of course, and Kings 1 and 2, which if you read Kings 1 and 2, it talks about the greatness of the kingdom of Judah and how the northern kings are doing poorly and are not good, and there's all these issues there. Obviously, it's written from somebody who's living from the support of the city of the country of Judah. So although it's written still with an idea that still the north existed, sometimes we were together, sometimes, so it's from the perspective of Judah, but not during a period where we're at war. Otherwise, the hate speech against the north would be much more vicious. Larry.
When did the practice of every Jewish congregation reading the same portion of the Torah, on the Sabbath come about? I mean, in the Christian religion, they pick and choose, depending on, I guess, whatever the priest wants to do. But yet, that seems to be a very combined binding thing in Judaism, that, every congregation, no matter where you go, they read the same portion of the Torah every week. And I was wondering how that came about. And the second question is, I've heard different thoughts about the Torah and the Haftorah. Haftorah not being half the Torah, but generally the prophets. When did that come about? Was that a reaction to the fact that they couldn't read the Torah certain times and that they were able to use the Haftorah as kind of like a way into keeping the learning going? I've heard different stories about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stories. Some would say it goes all the way back to the expulsion from Jerusalem in 587 BCE, that we were reading Torah in Babylon during the 5th century, 6th century BCE. Now, the Deuteronomic hypothesis would say that's not possible because it hadn't been redacted yet until the 5th century. There's no proof of that. If you want to go to where the proof is, or not proof, but evidence, you're starting after the destruction of the Second Temple. A century later, after the rabbis had really taken control of religion, you probably start seeing this Torah read in public. There is a belief that the Torah and the Bible became what it is today around the year 90 CE, after the destruction of the temple. So 50 years or so after that is when we start doing it. But if you talk about the tradition of reading a section every week, that is probably 6th, 7th century. So that comes during the Talmudic age. So that's only about 1400 years old. Probably started in Babylon, but in Israel, probably Israel maybe, then went to Babylon. And then probably by the 9th century with the Gaonim, that's when it was instituted. So we really started probably reading it aloud in the 200 CE, and it became official what we do in the 500s, and for sure official in the 800s. And we do have more, there is more evidence of that than certainly earlier. Again, the later you go, the more evidence. And you've got the Talmud, you've got some extra Talmudic writings, obviously. So we have that. So we're going to conclude here. Good talk, everybody. Anybody have a question before I conclude? Because I want to make sure we take a second to get any topics that people want. I'm going to type this down. Any people, yeah. All right, so any topics people are interested in, please let me know. Or we can do a session. We could do like 4 weeks on something. Or we can do individual topics each week. We can also just do for the next couple weeks. Any topic, just speak up. Let's get the juices flowing.
Not everybody at once.
All right. If not, I'll just come up with some.
Okay.
Maybe Alan can tell us about the Jews of Las Vegas.
That'd be awesome.
I have a question. I don't
Sure.
know if it's beyond the scope of what we do here, but
There's no scope. We can go anywhere.
the
We're
Torah
scopeless.
seems to have been still being written or edited or whatever after the birth of Christianity. How do they kind of tie in where there was a New Testament added to the Old Testament?
Well, I think that is something we can talk about. Yeah. We could talk about the formations of Christianity or the division between Christianity and Judaism.
That would be interesting.
Las Vegas. I wonder where that is. In the
No,
beaches.
no.
Okay, we could do that for the next week and maybe the next 2 weeks talk about that.
You're also,
Oh, is that so?
So,
next week, Peyton and
so we'll do Judaism and Christianity
On YouTube.
in
right?
the first, second, third century. How about that?
Rabbi, also, one of the other things I was thinking of, I know you used to do the interview program, and you had the interviews with different people, and one of them was this girl who was in Israel at the time, and she was, I think, a young lady from
Barbara
Savannah.
Sue, yeah, just got married.
Oh, okay, but I was wondering if maybe you can get her on once in a while to give us kind of an update. I know she was into theater in Israel.
Oh, sure. I'll be happy to have Barbara Sue speak. I'll see. I haven't talked to her in a while, too. And the wedding, I could not get on her to her. It just wasn't working. All right, so I'll see if I can get Barbara Sue now. We're not going to have class for the last week in September and the first week in October.
The holidays.
One of them is, yeah, even though one of them is, Yom Kippur, so I think it's okay to not have the class that day. The other one is right after Rosh Hashanah, so I'll have them take that day off. So just to let you know. All right, so we're going to do that. And then afterwards, I'll see if I can get Barbara Sue to come back and speak.
Yeah. Or Tim, even if Tim is available from Portugal, it'd be interesting to find out.
Yeah, I'll see if Tim. I can also see other people for. I can do one interview a month. I'm happy to do that.
I think that would be very interesting
Okay.
because we all know him.
All right, I'll see if Tim or Barbara Sue are available.
All right, that'd be great.
All right, so for the next 2 weeks, we're going to do first through third century. Well, maybe we'll just do it one. We'll see. Judaism and Christianity. And then we're going to take 2 weeks off for the high holidays. And then we'll start up hopefully with some interviews.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Okay.
We're rolling, man. We're jamming. I don't know how they roll in Texas, Vegas, Carolina, or Illinois, but this is how we roll online. We get it all done. So I hope everybody's doing well. I want to wish you all the best. I know you guys I didn't see any of you at Dragon Con. I was hoping to see some of you. I know Larry looks good at costumes. But hope everyone's well. Be safe, everyone. Oh, Genevieve had a question, I think. Is that your hand?
No, it's just clapping.
Okay, great. All right. And just in case you're wondering, all those theories I talked about, JEPD, the combination of JE, the Ezra redacting it all, the finalization of the Bible in the year 90, C, those are my own theories that I created all by myself through intense study. Other people use them, but they're really mine. And just I want to make sure everybody knows that. All right. Thanks, guys.
All right.
take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
You guys are awesome. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Anything you need, let me know. And also, don't forget, high holidays are coming up. Those in the area. If you want to come in, you just got to call in and reserve because we're having 2 services for each service for the main ones. And you just have to choose if you want to come to the early or late. You can start that next week.
Yeah. I also wanted to just ask you a quick question about the Israel trip. That's only a 6-day trip, it looked like.
It's
a very short trip.
You can add another day for $50.
So that's
The
7 days.
trip itself is a little different. It's through the Federation of Atlanta. So you pick your own track. If I go as a community, which I'm probably going to do, then if we want to get together as a community, we can get together as Savannahans like Wednesday night, Thursday night, and Saturday, and then on the additional day, and we'll plan extra stuff for that if
Okay.
people want to do that.
It just seemed like a very short period of
It is a
time.
short trip, but you can add more. I mean, you can add for $50, you can add a whole day. That includes hotel and everything.
Mm.
So there's no reason not to. Plus, it gets you the next day. If you add that extra day, the next day you can get a direct flight to Atlanta. So that's why a lot of people are doing that. So if you're going to do it, I'd highly recommend at least one extra day. I'd highly recommend.
Where can we get information on that?
It's on our website. I'll send it out to everybody. It's on the Federation. So I'll send it out to everybody from the Federation. And then we may go on another trip next year. We'll see, depending on number of people go this year. And if we go again next year, it'll be just a synagogue trip. The year after next year.
If we went as a synagogue by, afterwards, is there a possibility of staying on even more than just another day or two? Or
Oh yeah, you can do it whatever you want. I mean, we have the. It's just it will be we'll have to pay the extra costs ourselves.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So again,
The group, but you're not going to form any kind of a group that wanted to stay on or any kind
we're
of.
we're going to see. We're going to send out notes. That's a possibility.
Okay. Yeah,
I
because
talk to them.
Such a long trip with a day travel each way. You
I
kind
know.
of.
I know.
It just seemed like
So
such
you're
a
there
short
for 4
period of time.
days.
Yeah.
I know. So
Yeah.
we're gonna do our best. Originally, we wanted to do our trip